and welcome back again to History and Politics Chat on July 7th, 2020. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, and I don't speak for my employer when I do these. And today, after a glitch, and I apologize to all of you, and I'm going to start again, as I say, from where I was when we lost the feed. It was about 8 minutes. And so I will go the full hour today. And if you remember, if you need to quit, go for it. And we will later post this here on Facebook, but also on my YouTube channel. So if you don't get it, it just won't be live. It'll be the same thing. So what I want to do today is cover some material that you've asked about again. And I don't like to go backward, but so many of you have asked about this. It seemed like it would not be a bad idea to go over this again. So what I want to start with is with the Electoral College, and then I'll talk about why you care about it right now, why so many people seem to care about it. And what I wanted to start with was the idea, as so many people on the right say, that the Electoral College must be preserved because it was the way that the framers wanted to protect small states. That's not right. And people on the left say it was to protect slavery and we should get rid of it on that grounds. And that's not really right either. And what I want to talk about today is not a protection necessarily of the Electoral College, but rather a recognition of how its use has broken down and how it no longer does what it's supposed to do. And I am happy to be an agnostic on whether we need it or not, but what I'm not an agnostic on is the number of people who say we have to preserve it as it is because it's what the framers wanted. It is not what the framers wanted. And I have a hard time having people defend the Electoral College in its current, very broken way of being with the words that it belonged to the framers. So either we should go back to what the framers wanted, which I think most people could live with quite happily, or we should adjust the spirit of it to a new system, which I think most people could go to happily. But what we don't want is to continue to use what is a really broken down older system. All right, so the way it works is this. You have to remember that in order to understand the Electoral College, you have to start from the position that the framers did not believe in political parties. They did not want political parties. They thought they were unhealthy. And a lot of what they put in place was designed to prevent the rise of, or not to prevent the rise of political parties. They just didn't think they would rise. So a lot of what they put in place was designed to be bipartisan or nonpartisan, when in fact it became partisan really quickly. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as well. At the same time, they also did not have modern media. And that's really going to matter too, because media in the early republic was vibrant, but it was limited. It was very limited in scope, and it was not what we in geographical range, and it was not what we know of as media today that tries to present the news, the breaking news. Instead, it was more sort of a digest of what an educated man should know. So you had people tended to know about the doings of their states, but not necessarily about what was happening in all the colonies at large, or even in the nation at large, because you just couldn't move the information around that quickly. You're not going to get information services until you really get the telegraph, which is going to go across the country during the Spanish-American War. But you're not going to get the press aggregates until after the Civil War. So the media is not what it is today, and that's going to matter in just a second. All right, so when the founders or when the framers developed the Electoral College, they had to overcome a problem, and that was that in the 13 new states, there was the problem of the fact that most people would not know the leading men in other states because they wouldn't have access to those people. They wouldn't have access to their speeches. They wouldn't have access to their kinship networks. They simply wouldn't know. If you were in Georgia, you wouldn't know who the leading men were in Massachusetts or New Jersey or New York, and vice versa. So they had to build in a layer, or they felt they had to build in a layer between the actual voters and the people that were going to be elevated to the top of the political system. And the reason, one of the things I want to make sure I get to is the degree to which there are systems in place in our government to slow things down, to gum up the works, so that that everybody is a stakeholder in a way that they wouldn't be if you had a much more direct, faster system. And I hope I remember to talk about that in a little bit. So anyway, what the framers came up with was a way to create a layer between the voters and the people that they elected to the presidency. And those people are called the electors. And the electors are supposed to meet in a group called the Electoral College. And the way this worked was that each state got an equal number of electors for its senators and representatives. So every state would have at least 2 electors for its senators and at least 1 for its representative, because even a small state would have 1 representative. And if you were a bigger state, you would have more people in the Electoral College because you would have more representatives. And theoretically, this would mean that the larger states would have a bigger say in who got to move up the chain to become president. So when people voted, and even today, when you vote, you are not technically voting for president. In the 19th century, the ballots actually didn't have the president's name on them. They had the president at the top of the ballot in a picture, a very crude picture, but some caricature by which you could recognize who the presidential candidate was. And you would vote for a slate of electors who would go in and cast their ballots for your presidential candidate. The theory was that what would happen is you would vote for a slate of electors who were well known in your community and probably men who had connections in other states and would kind of be able to make good decisions about who would be a good president. So the idea was that these electors would get together and they would argue, and some people would throw up their favorite sons and others would throw up their favorite sons. And after they'd argued for a while, generally they would come up with 2 or 3 or 4 leading candidates. And then the election would go into the House of Representatives, where each state would get 1 vote. The ultimate goal was usually not to come up with a winner in the Electoral College, although that would be just lovely if that happened, but that it would be decided in the House of Representatives. So how does this play out? It plays out easily at first, because in the first 2 elections held in the new republic, George Washington just walks away with it. I mean, nobody argues with the idea that the father of the country should be the president of the country as well. And so it's not really, the Electoral College is really not a problem in the first 2 elections. But then, if you remember, George Washington steps down. Now I can't think of the line from Hamilton where he says, I have to teach people to move on. And he steps down, and that means that it's not really clear who the next president is going to be. And by then, we have political parties. And people have asked me why I don't like Jefferson. And one of the there's a lot of reasons I don't like Jefferson, but one of the reasons I don't like Jefferson is because he was so two-faced all the time. Like, my big thing is disagree with me, fine. Have different interests in me, fine, but don't lie to me. And Jefferson lied to everybody all the time, as near as I could tell. Sorry, I know I've just made people's heads explode. He's not one of my favorite people. Neither is Salmon P. Chase, who's the Secretary of the Treasury under Abraham Lincoln. He does the same thing. Anyway, I'm an equal opportunity angry historian, I guess. Anyway, so what happens is in the next election after Washington steps down. And by the way, remember, Washington steps down in part because of political parties. He's so angry at the rise of political parties and at the constant carping against him, the idea that he wants to be a dictator, he wants to be a king, and he gets mad and he says, I'm going to go back to Mount Vernon and hang out with Martha. And in that next election, in the election of 1796, it becomes clear that when John Adams is elected, Jefferson looks at that moment and he recognizes that if he had been able to have all of the electoral votes from Virginia, he would have won the election. Because until then, electoral votes were not winner take all. They were divided by state. So you could have a state that did not get all of the electoral votes to one, give all the electoral votes to one candidate. So Jefferson looks at this, he says, well, we got to get Virginia together, because if all the electoral votes from Virginia, which has bucket loads of them compared to other states, will back me for president, I will win the presidency. And that's exactly what happens in 1800. Jefferson becomes the president in part because in his home state, the electors did not divide according to the voters in the state, but it was a winner-take-all system. Well, once that happens, other states look at what Virginia has done and they realize they're in terrible trouble, because if Virginia's going to pull that, they have to pull the same thing or their candidates won't stand a chance. So they're going to have to aggregate their electoral college votes as well and make their systems winner take all systems as well. And this happens really quickly. After the election of 1800, we get the fact that most states go to a winner take all system. And now, off the top of my head, I believe there's 2 states that are not winner take all states. And I think it's Nebraska and Maine, both of which have only 3 electoral votes. So it's not that big a deal. And I might tell you more about that in a minute. All right. So what does this mean? This means that, first of all, the electoral system has changed. So instead of it being a relatively accurate reflection of what voters want in a state, it has become winner take all. And when this happens, one of the key fathers, right? One of the key founders, framers, James Madison, who is again known as the father of the Constitution, freaks out. He says, this is not what we ever intended. This is going to skew the results of an election, and we must get rid of the winner-take-all system. And in 1823, he writes a letter saying we need to amend the Constitution to make sure that nobody can do this. It never happens. The amendment to the Constitution stopping the winner-take-all system never happens, in part because if you have won based on that system, as every president by definition has after 1804, you're not going to change it. So that's the first place we run into a problem with the Electoral College. But that's not the only place. The next place we get into trouble is with the idea that you can throw things into the House of Representatives where everybody gets 1 vote. And if you remember, that happened once in American history. It happened in the election of 1824. And when that happened, the House deadlocked. They couldn't agree between 4 candidates. And finally, in an attempt to make sure that Andrew Jackson does not become president, Henry Clay throws his votes to someone else. And that creates this absolute havoc in the country where Andrew Jackson's supporters say that he's been robbed of the election. So that's the last time that it went into the House of Representatives, although there have been 2 other occasions where it could have and maybe should have. So people kind of really sour on the whole idea of the House of Representatives ultimately deciding who should be the president from the taking over from the electoral system. I just saw, by the way, somebody corrected me. Nebraska has 5 electoral votes. Maine has 3. Nebraska has 5. But I believe, off the top of my head, those are the only 2 states that split their electoral votes. The point being that those are not huge electoral vote states. Anyway, so that's the first problem. So the next problem that comes up is that, as I said, theoretically, the electors in the Electoral College should be weighted according to state size. That is, as a state grows, it should get more and more electors. That's the way it was designed. Now, remember, in the era of the Constitution, the framers could not conceive of what the United States of America was going to become in terms of size. So this seemed like a really workable system. But it wasn't, in the sense that the House of Representatives began to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, in 1929, the House of Representatives is formally capped at how many seats? 435 representatives. So that means that the larger states, the really huge states, are never going to be proportionally represented either in Congress or in the Electoral College. That's another issue that needs to be resolved if we're going to keep the concept of the Electoral College, because right now the big states are badly underrepresented, which means that the people in those states don't have a vote that's equal to the people who vote in smaller states. All right, so now we have 2 problems. We have both the fact that we've got a winner-take-all system, and we have the problem of the fact that the House of Representatives has been capped, and therefore the Electoral College is not weighted proportionally the way that it should be. All right, so where do we go from here? What this means is that the Electoral College does not any longer represent, maybe really since 1804, represented what the American people wanted. But it has generally moved along okay. with four major exceptions. And those four major exceptions really matter. And they matter now even more than they did in the past. So there are four times that somebody has won the popular vote by a significant amount and then lost in the Electoral College. And that is a real crisis in democracy, because if a majority of your people have voted for somebody other than the head of the government, they're going to feel like it's not legitimate. They're going to feel like it's not their government. And the four times that it has happened have all put a Republican in the White House rather than the Democrat who won the popular vote. And I'm not making that's a partisan that's an observation of partisanship, but I'm not going to make an argument for why that's happened. I suppose it could be coincidence, except for the fact it seems like four times is a bit much. It may be that. It may be that the first two times were coincidence. Lately, things seem a little different. In any case, I don't really have an answer for why it has been four times it's gone to a Republican over a Democrat. But I do think that's worth having on the table, especially since Republicans talk now a lot about Democrats stealing the White House or stealing things, when in fact it's four times been a Republican who has won the White House when a Democrat has won the popular vote. So those four times are these. First of all, there's 1876, the contested election of 1876, when Samuel Tilden, a Reformed Democrat of New York City, wins the popular vote by a lot, by about 250,000 votes, and loses in the Electoral College to Rutherford B. Hayes. And I want to stop there for a minute and explain how that happened, because of the reasons people are talking about it now. That happened because there was a fight over four, not three, somebody said recently, four states that had contested election results. And in the end, the House of Representatives investigates, and the House of Representatives ultimately is dominated by Republicans, and the Republicans conclude in the cases of the three southern states that they will be Republican states, and they will put Rutherford B. Hayes into the White House. And they argue that the Democrats cheated, and that's why they can get away with that, and that's how they can put Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House. And that's 76. It happens again in 1888, and when that happens, Benjamin Harrison, who's a Republican, loses the popular vote by about 100,000 votes to the Democrat Grover Cleveland, who's an incumbent. He's actually in the White House. And that's a little more interesting, because it appears that what happened in the Electoral College was probably a sleight of hand. That in 1876, the electors switched their votes for Rutherford B. Hayes largely because they were promised favors from the government, essentially, for their regions. In 1888, it appears that there was something more untoward than that. There's one guy, crucially, who switches some important votes in the New York delegation, and it's always been quite shady as to why that happened. He was a railroad man, and I never felt real good about that one, let me tell you. And then the other two are more recent, and that is, of course, Al Gore won the popular vote in 2000, and George W. Bush won in the Electoral College, and that's a really interesting case because of why there wasn't a recount in Florida to establish that in fact Gore had won the Florida electors. As it really appears that he did. And that happened because there was a real riot during the recount known as the Brooks Brothers Riot, and that was led by Roger Stone. And the reason I mention that is because I think that this actually bleeds into why people care about the Electoral College today. So that was our Roger Stone, the one who is right now arguing that he shouldn't have to go to jail because of the coronavirus. And then finally, of course, it happened in 2016 with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And the fact that he won by very, very few votes, concentrated in three particular states, even though she won the popular vote by quite a lot, by more than 1 million votes. All right, so we have this disjunction between the popular vote and the electoral vote. So there's a couple things about this that are also worth pointing out, looking forward to the present, or the 2020 election. And that is, it's really important to remember that it does take a long time to count votes, and it ought to take a long time to count votes. The pressure to count votes quickly and to have an answer election night eve is driven by the television media. They want to have this big thing and dials and signs and people talking and all that so that they can do it quickly. Quick does not necessarily serve anybody's best interests. So remember that this election coming up quite likely won't be answered the night of the election. Even though we're all going to be on the edge of a cliff, it probably won't be answered. So that's how the Electoral College was supposed to work, and there are the problems with the Electoral College. But the reason you guys are all asking about this is because, of course, this article that came out in Newsweek this week, I guess, talking about how Donald Trump could game the system so that he could win, even though he has lost the popular vote and probably lost in the Electoral College. And let me walk you through that a bit. First of all, the argument in Newsweek, as I understood it, was that what could happen is that Trump will say that the election was fraudulent, that the wrong people voted, or that the votes weren't counted right, that it was rigged. All right, is this original to him? No. This is exactly what happened in 1876, and it is exactly what happened in a number of elections in the late 1890s when people who lost, and actually in that case all Republicans as well, but that's kind of a different story. When they lost, they said that they lost because the votes had been rigged, that the wrong people had voted. This is one of the ways that we get restrictions on voting in the late 19th century. And it happens beginning again in America in the 1990s when Republican candidates argue that they lose elections because Democrats cheat. And that really comes from their frustration over the 1993 motor voter law, which enrolls a lot more poor voters and people of color who tend to vote Democratic. So after that, Republicans increasingly say that they're losing not because they're actually losing, but because the Democrats are cheating. There is, and let me emphasize this a gazillion times, there is virtually no evidence of any voter fraud in America committed by voters. Now, there's other ways to game the system at a higher level, but committed by voters, it just doesn't happen. And you can see this by the fact one of the first things that Trump did when he got into office was he put together a voter fraud commission. You might have forgotten this, but it was run by Chris Kobach of Kansas, who, saw fraudulent voters behind every bush, and it had to be quietly disbanded because they had no evidence. So it really doesn't happen. But that whole argument that the election was fraudulent is not new at all. It's an old trope for anybody who can no longer command a majority. So could Trump do that? Sure. He tried to do it in 2016. He laid the groundwork for it. He kept talking about how it was rigged the election was rigged in 2016. He's already doing the same thing now. So the argument in Newsweek is, first of all, he's going to argue that it's rigged, and then he's going to say that the votes, that there has been this attempt to destroy his election. And now things get a little sticky because the people who would look into this, of course, are the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice is overseen by Attorney General William Barr. And Attorney General William Barr is pretty clearly no longer acting in the interests of the American people. He is acting as Trump's defender. And that's hugely problematic because the Attorney General is not the attorney for Donald Trump or for the office of the White House. He is the attorney for the American people. The attorney for the president is the White House counsel, and then underneath the White House counsel, he or she defends the office of the president, and then the president, him or herself, have their own personal lawyers. That's not what Attorney General Barr is supposed to be doing, but it's clear that he is running interference for Donald Trump, and that's why so many people who are former employees of the Department of Justice have signed letters and called for his removal and tried to get rid of him and talked about the politicization, as it's called, of the Department of Justice. So what does he do? So what does Trump do under this scenario? He goes to the Department of Justice and the Department of Justice says, yeah, this wasn't fair, this wasn't right. And then he drags stuff out and gets the Department of Justice to argue in front of the Supreme Court that Donald Trump should in fact be president. This too has happened, right? This is what happened with Bush v. Gore. And the Supreme Court did hand down the decision that put George W. Bush in the White House. Later, Sandra Day O'Connor, who had been appointed by Ronald Reagan, said it was a terrible mistake to do that. But could this happen? Yeah, it absolutely could happen. But now stop for a minute. Everything I've told you is terrifying, right? Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to add in there that the intelligence agencies are now under the control of Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe, who was a real Trump loyalist from Texas, could say, yeah, we have evidence. The FBI has evidence that there was cheating going on, even if there wasn't, right? So it looks terrifying, right? That we're in real trouble. And could it all happen? Yes. But now stop for a minute and play out what that looks like. If, first of all, it's July right now. It's July 7th. That election is August, September, October, 4 months away. It's 4 months away in the middle of a pandemic, a horrific pandemic in which America is worse off than the rest of the world. And we've already got over 130,000 deaths, and those numbers are climbing. It's an election that's going to be held as the economy is cratering, because not only are we in trouble on the macro level because of the pandemic, the additional payments on unemployment insurance, the initial $600 unemployment insurance, is going to run out at the end of this month, just at the time that state and local governments are trying to put together their budgets. And of course, they're decimated because they haven't gotten any tax money coming in because of the pandemic. And by law, their budgets almost always have to be balanced. So the only way that they can fix things is to lay people off. So, okay, that's going to contribute to an economic crisis in the middle of all this. You also have to recognize that this this Russia bounty scandal is actually huge. I mean, it's kind of funny to me how little play it's gotten for a president to look the other way after a country that has not declared war on us has put a bounty on our soldiers is just unthinkable. And that's not going to go away. And one of the things that happened this weekend that I didn't write about yet because there wasn't enough teeth in it yet, is John Ratcliffe came out and said, no, that's all political. It didn't happen. Well, good luck with that, because a lot of people have already chimed in to say, yeah, it did happen. And this is something we have to deal with. So that's all going on. And I'll point out that not only is the president's mental health apparently deteriorating, but also we still have some really big Supreme Court cases out there that are game changers. If the Supreme Court in the next 2 weeks decides that, in fact, Trump's accountants and lawyers and the Trump administration itself have to in different cases, have to hand over Trump's financials and tax returns, it's a game changer. Why do you think he's hidden those for as long as he has? That's really going to matter as well. So there's a lot that can happen between now and then. So even still, okay, so give me all that and still stay with me. And so, okay, so all that doesn't matter. And the scenario that the Newsweek guy laid out comes to pass. Okay, so what does that look like? Think about it. What does that look like? So Trump has lost in my scenario. He has lost. I'm playing out the Newsweek article. He's lost, and people are really want him out. He's lost the election, and he's saying, no, I won because I'm gaming the system. Do people take that? I mean, we knew from what happened in Lafayette Square that the military's not going to stand with him. They've made that really clear. So where does he turn? Well, okay, so maybe he turns to the people that Attorney General Barr can command. The Justice Department has at their disposal about 123,000 troops that are spread out in different places. Are they really going to try and do that? What's the end game? Where does that scenario come out well for the president? I don't see it. What I see when I look at this, and again, I still maintain that there's a lot that's going to happen between now and then. I do not foresee this all happening. But if it did, what I see is a president who would cause as much trauma and damage as he could as leverage in order to get himself out of the White House by getting things like a presidential pardon or a promise from the Southern District of New York that they would not prosecute him and his family. We're not in a great place in America, but I think when people jump to this is it, there's going to be a takeover, I'm still not there yet, simply because not by the way that I think that he would object to doing that if it were possible to do, but because, as I say, that there are so many layers slowing things down. It's a hard one for me to worry about yet. Could it happen? Absolutely. Have things like that happened before in pieces? Absolutely. Is this moment when it's going to happen again? Perhaps not with this embattled a president. All right, I hope that comforted you to some degree. I want to get on to a couple of other things. Some things that are just fun, and some that are, I don't know, it's a July afternoon. Let's have a little bit of fun. All right, so there's some funny questions here. First of all, somebody asked, and I wanted to put this right here with these other discussions about the Electoral College. Did Lincoln steal his own nomination and his own election? Abraham Lincoln, the president who's elected in 1860. And this is a really fun question in that, first of all, I think the large question, did he steal the election? No. He won by a plurality. That means there were a number of people in the race. There were four major candidates in the race, and he won more than any of the rest of them. It's slightly under 40% of the vote, as I recall. But the other ones split all the other votes. So he did win the election. There was never a dispute about that. And he might have gotten more votes than he did had the southern states even put him on the ballot, which they didn't. So did he steal the election? No. But somebody asked another question, and that is, did he steal the nomination from all the other candidates? And the answer to that is also no, but it's going to illuminate something else, so I'm going to mention it. And that is that he didn't steal it, absolutely not. But Lincoln was a politician. Lincoln was a brilliant politician, and he had brilliant politicians working for him. And they did a number of things that were completely legal and very smart. And I don't think most people would object to them unless you were on another side. But they did things, for example, like making sure that the Republican National Convention in 1860 was in Illinois. Well, this gives Lincoln a huge leg up because it means that he's going to have people out in the streets screaming and yelling for him. And people like William Henry Seward from New York, who's his chief competitor, aren't. Nor is Salmon P. Chase from Ohio, simply because it's too far to go over to Illinois. So managing to get it held in Illinois is a really big deal. That mattered a lot more in the 19th century than it does now. But even now, they hold where you hold a convention is a signal to your voters what you consider to be important. So first of all, they get it in Illinois, and they do a lot of jockeying to make sure that he's got a good chance. And my favorite thing that he does comes from my friend Mike Green, who's a real Lincoln scholar, and he knows everything about everything when it comes to politics. He's a professor at University of Nevada at Las Vegas, and he points out that when they actually sat the delegates for the different states, they put the New York delegation that was going to be backing William Henry Seward in the corner and then put other people around them. So those men couldn't circulate around the room very easily. Whereas Lincoln's men had a great space in the convention so they could go make deals and chat with people and all that. Perfectly legal. But, one of those things that they couldn't really get called on it because somebody had to sit in the back corner. But the fact they walled in the New York delegation was really actually not a small deal when it came time for the actual balloting. So did Lincoln steal the nomination? No, he did not steal the nomination. But he had some very, very smart handlers, and he himself was a smart handler. Now, one of the other things that matters about this in the fact that they got Lincoln, and that I'm going to segue into here to another question somebody asked, is that Lincoln was actually a really good nominee in 1860 because he was certainly a Republican. He was the man who articulated what it meant to be a Republican in 1859, but he was not perceived in any way as a radical, except by his opponents. But within the party, you could get behind Lincoln even if you didn't believe in black rights, even if you did believe in black rights. But you could get behind him in a way that you could never have gotten behind William Henry Seward or Sam and Pete Chase, both of whom were perceived as radicals, or behind some of the much more conservative Republicans who were slaveholders themselves, and you couldn't have gotten behind them. So Lincoln was really kind of a straight moderate down the road, and that's one of the things that is interesting about this upcoming 2020 election, is that so many people want their candidate, right? They want their candidate, especially on the left, because we all think that we could order the world better than anybody else could, right? But one of the things that conventions do is they force the different factions of a party to come together and agree on things, and that's where the party platform comes in. And a lot of people have asked, why is why is Bernie Sanders still trying to get delegates? Why, what happens to Buttigieg's delegates? What about Klobuchar's? What's going to happen, and the reason you continue to try and get delegates for as long as you possibly can, is because those people then have a voice in the platform, and that platform does matter. So if you've been watching it all, and I know I don't write a lot about this because there's only a certain number of words I have, but if you've been watching, Sanders and Biden have been working together very closely, both on policies, but also on the people that are going to be writing the platform together. And Sanders couldn't have done that if he'd pulled out earlier or if he had not gotten so many delegates. So that's why you fight so hard for delegates. So that goes into the next question that people have asked. And that somebody asked, how did Biden suddenly surge? What happened there? And so here is what it looks like to me happened with Biden's sudden surge for the Democratic nomination in 2020, which, by the way, he doesn't have. I still keep calling him the presumptive Democratic nominee because he is the presumptive Democratic nominee. He is not the Democratic nominee. He has not been nominated yet. We all expect he will be, but he has not been yet. So technically, he is not the nominee. Right now, it sure looks like he's going to be, but there you go. Anyway. So how did that happen? Well, one of the things that some people picked up on in the early balloting for the Democratic nomination was that people had their favorites, and first, one would go ahead, Buttigieg would go ahead, and then Klobuchar or whomever would go ahead. What it looked like to those of us who were kind of stepping back and looking at the total picture was that the field had broken in two. It had broken between two people perceived to be farther left, and I'm talking about the way they were perceived. I don't want to argue about their actual policies, but Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, and Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, were both perceived as being farther left than the others. And the others, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, were there others? I can't remember. That sounds like about right. They were splitting their votes and going back and forth, but they were all perceived as more moderate. So two things happened to suddenly throw Biden up. And there's a lot of horse racing going on here. So if you don't perform well, it hurts. And Sanders did not perform nearly as well as people thought he was going to. And I know I'm going to have Bernie people jumping all over me about that, but he just didn't. He didn't get the votes. And that surprised a lot of people. Anyway, what happened was that at first these moderates were all not stealing votes from each other. They were taking each other's votes. As those moderates dropped out, Biden started shooting up. And then the Democratic caucuses, what's the word? When you vote for the candidate, the Democratic primaries moved to the South. And African American voters tended to be much more moderate than Bernie and Warren. And it was actually African American voters who really put the muscle behind Biden's campaign. So the reason I wanted to emphasize that and emphasize what all this means with Lincoln and now with Biden is that people tend to forget that politics is very much like a chess game. And it's, you want to just take your queen and go rip out the king on the other side and call it a day. But that's not the way it works. It's like a chess game in that you've got to get everybody to buy in. And that means, your bishops are going to go one direction and not really cooperate very well with the rooks, and the rooks are doing their thing, and the knights are jumping all over the place, and the pawns can go forward two sometimes and one sometimes, and sometimes when they feel like they can go side by side, they can go to a corner. But what that means is that it's rare for everybody to get who they want when you've gone through this game, if you will. And I don't mean it in a frivolous sense, but the idea of conventions, the idea of different states, the idea of different factions is to sort of throw everything into a scrum and see who everybody can live with. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because even though your person may not be the person you like, with luck, the platform on which that person stands has a bit of you in it, and a bit of your neighbor in Georgia, and a bit of your friend and your enemy in California. And you have come to a place where you can agree on a direction that you want the country to move, not around one person, but rather around a team and a set of principles. And that's sort of what was happening with Lincoln, and certainly what was happening now with the surge around Biden when it happened. Now, here's another question about Lincoln that came up. And I just saw somebody ask a question about Kanye throwing his hat in the ring. I'm not going to worry a lot about Kanye yet. He tweeted. He doesn't have a campaign. He doesn't, I mean, we'll see. I mean, I'm holding off my judgment on that one. Anyway, but the other thing that people asked about with Lincoln and with Washington is, what do you say when people say they were white supremacists? I think maybe the answer is yeah. That in their era, they couldn't conceive of a world in which white men didn't rule everything. And they weren't just white supremacists, they were also incredible sexists. I mean, women shouldn't have a vote. Washington couldn't even think about it. So yeah, that's really no surprise. But you knew there was a but coming. There always is a but coming for me, right? A couple of things when you point to this. Lincoln was able to look at his own prejudices, but also society around him, and say, just because I don't want to marry an African American woman does not mean she should not have the right to the fruits of her own labor. And the idea that African American men should have rights to what they produced. That's a really big jump from the slaveholders, who said they should have no rights at all. You know, Lincoln was prejudiced for sure, but he was not willing to take basic civic rights away from African American men, in part, I think, because he was able to imagine what it would look like if the shoe were on the other foot. And he talks about that in a number of fragments, and also when he talks about a book that he read that I don't really have time to go into now. But so there is that, first of all, that he understands that the principle of self-determination should apply to everybody that he is capable of seeing as somebody capable of self-determination. So he can't see it for indigenous peoples, perhaps, but he can see it and he can't see it for women, but he can see it for African Americans and for Chinese immigrants. That's another one that he is aware of, and certainly for Irish immigrants. So he understands that concept should be expanded. The place that people have a sticking point is with Lincoln talking about colonization, and I want to and the idea that he talks about sending African Americans who are just as American as anybody else back to Africa, to a country they don't know the language, have never been to. And I think pretty definitively a man named Michael Vorenberg, who's a professor now at Brown, has proven that this was Lincoln being political. He talks a lot about colonization in the early years of the war when he's trying to get border states on board with emancipation. But the minute he passes emancipation, he never not passes. The minute he signs the Emancipation Proclamation, he never talks about colonization again. So I think, regardless of his own personal feelings, it was completely unrealistic even to talk about colonization in those days in any case, although the American Colonization Society stays in effect almost until the 20th century, believe it or not. But so colonization is a little bit of a red herring, because it is seemingly politically motivated, an attempt to try and get people on board behind his program and behind emancipation, in order to make sure he didn't lose political support by backing emancipation. So so what else is I going to say about Lincoln? Lincoln, white supremacists. So the other thing I would say about the founders, the framers, and their racism and their sexism, because never forget that these people felt even worse about women, if they could, than they did about people of color, and female people of color, of course, until really recently, right? Like, you know, how long ago, and off the top of my head, I don't know, was it considered to be impossible that you could rape somebody if you were married to them. I mean, welcome to, the 21st century. But so even though they had those weaknesses, those blind spots, I still maintain it's really important to recognize the people who understand the principle of self-determination, because we all have blind spots, and we don't know how we're going to be seen in 3 generations. I promise you, it's not well. I don't. I have my guesses about where people will be horrified by our blind spots. My guess is it's with the use of fossil fuels, but there are constants in human society as far as I'm concerned, and a belief in democracy and in human self-determination is a real difference than somebody saying, yes, I don't like women, I don't like people of color, and they should all belong to me. That seems to me to be a principle worth keeping in mind when we talk about the white supremacists of all American leaders until yesterday. I'm overstating it, but maybe not by much. Or by the sexism of all American leaders, also until male leaders anyway, until yesterday. So worth keeping in mind that it is possible to be both blind, flawed, and human and still believe in principles that we can build on. All right, so one more thing on this, and then I hope I'm going to have time to get to something else I wanted to talk about. And that is that, a couple more things here. Maybe I'll just do this today and we'll call it a day and not get to campaign finance, which I'm really interested in. Anyway, so somebody asked me, you may or may not know, my partner is a lobsterman, a commercial lobster fisherman. And somebody asked how he was faring with all the, with lobster being as cheap as it is here in Maine, and what did I have to say about Trump's, as he said, saving the lobster industry, which he talked about the other day. And I wanted to build on that because one of the things that you're seeing from the Trump administration right now is that they're trying to throw our money, our tax dollars, to constituencies that they think will matter to them in 2020. And they're hoping that they can pick up at least one electoral vote here in Maine by throwing money at the lobster industry. And that shows up here. The lobster industry is, of course, badly hurt by the 2 things. First of all, by the tariffs with China, but also until very recently with the border being closed with Canada, because a lot of our lobsters go out through Canada as well as through the States over to China. So they were hurting before it came, even the pandemic hit, and the pandemic has not helped because restaurants have shut and tour boats have shut down. But throwing money at the lobster industry right now made for good headlines. Is it going to solve the problems of the industry? Not holding my breath. But that's the reason I even mention that and bring that up is because you see this in a lot of places. Now that I've mentioned it, watch the news stories. And I've written about this before because really dramatically about 3 weeks ago now, off the top of my head, I can't remember how many it was, there was an announcement of a lot of money coming out of the Department of Transportation. And very targeted grants to specific states. And they were specific states where Trump is losing ground rapidly and that he really needs to win re-election. And of course, they came out of the Department of Transportation, which is run by Mitch McConnell's wife, who's the Secretary of Transportation. That's Elaine Chao. And that was really obvious that it was simply an attempt to buy votes. And you will see this, you're seeing this again and again out of the administration, the way they distributed PPEs and ventilators for the coronavirus. They, as you remember, they retained a bunch of those that states had bought so that they could then dole them out on their own according to what they considered need, but it was pretty clear it was going on a political basis. You're seeing it with contracts. You're seeing federal efforts being made to reinforce Trump's reelection rather than for the general good of all people, all Americans. And that's really problematic, and that's illegal. And there is going to be reckoning about that at some point, of course, depending on what happens in the 2020 elections. So I wanted to mention that about the lobsters, and Buddy's fine. But the other question is, people have asked me about the letter that just appeared, I think today or yesterday in Harper's Magazine, talking about calling for open debate. And is this a normal reaction to the kind of dissent we have going on in America? And the story behind it is this, is that Harper's has published here in July an article that's going to be appearing in October. And it's been signed by a number of really quite prominent thinkers on both the right and the left. And what they're saying is that they're very concerned about the stifling of public debate by people on the right who are, making it difficult for people to speak out, and from people on the left that they're calling cancel culture, the idea that if you say things that are not welcome, that you get shouted down and you get silenced. And is this normal? It doesn't strike me as being abnormal. I mean, it doesn't hurt, right? We are all in favor of free speech. It does strike me, although I really respect a lot of the names on that letter, it doesn't strike me as any kind of a game changer. It kind of strikes me as a marker that they're going to stand and say these are, we care about open debate. But really, the right has been silencing debate for a long time, and it's sort of interesting as I'm watching out of the corner of my eye, the scrolling of the comments on this video going by. Apparently it's being swarmed by trolls trying to harass the people who are watching it and trying to harass me. That really happens far more on the right than it does on the left. And it concerns me a little bit when people talk about cancel culture or, we can't speak because we're going to get shouted down. A lot of that, to me, and, I try and keep a fairly open mind here, sounds like it's stuff people don't want to hear. And when somebody calls them out on it and says, you can't do that, you can't act that way, then they say they're being silenced. Opening up, making sure that people have room to speak is not, doesn't mean that other people can't. And I think that maybe that's an important distinction to be made, that you don't want to shut people up, but the fact that people are saying things you don't want to hear doesn't necessarily mean that they are drowning you out, and it's okay to have those voices there. No, it's more than okay. It's important to have those voices there. That being said, I think we've been way too tolerant of hate speech in this country for a long time, and for doxing, and for the kind of stuff that's happening right now on this Facebook page right now. The idea that you can so flood the zone with, I'm sorry, as Steve Bannon says, shit, that you can shut other people up is a very real problem. And it's a real problem that really the right has been engaging in for a long time, at least if you take a look at my emails over the last 20 years. So that's what the letter is about. I don't think it does any harm. It's certainly, it's nice to see a number of intellectuals coming together and agreeing on something. I'm not sure, as I say, that it's a game changer in what it's going to do. All right, so I don't really think I have the time to talk anymore about, or to get into, got 9 minutes. I guess maybe I have a little bit of space to talk about financing and the way that elections are financed. I guess that ties into the issue of free speech, because we're in this funny place where we are right now because of the idea of free speech in America and who gets the right to have free speech and what does free speech mean. And I think I might get into that a little bit backward because, of course, the 2010 Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court dramatically changes what it means to have free speech in America and what it means to be able to speak politically in America, because it changes the way that we finance political campaigns. And that's really an issue. The issue of the idea that corporations should have the right to say whatever they want and that you can't stop them from speaking because that's free speech creates a real imbalance, because the reality is that, my neighbor who can speak to 3 people really can't hold himself up against speaking the same way that a corporation can. And by knocking off that balance, the idea that corporations with essentially unlimited money are going to be able to say whatever they want, that's a lot of what the stifling of free speech around here really is about. The flooding of the zone, if you will, the being able to hire people to do things like are happening right now on this Facebook feed, to simply swamp the other side so that they can't get a hearing. And that I think is maybe a bigger problem than the idea of cancel culture is the idea of really big money in politics, and that the idea that big money should be able to say whatever it wants is really what's been determining our elections since the 2010 Supreme Court decision, the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. And one of the things that that did, of course, is it opened up the ability for corporations to have what were called super PACs. The idea that they're political action committees that are not affiliated with a candidate's campaign. They certainly can support a candidate, or they can support a candidate's causes, but they're not affiliated with a campaign, and therefore they don't have to disclose the money that they raise, where it comes from, or how much there is. That really threw wide open the door for money to pour into political campaigns, money that we don't know where it came from. And that, and this is a bit of a jump, but an interesting one. It seems to me pretty easy as a thinker to go from, I can take as much money for my super PAC as I need to advance my cause, and I can take it from immigrants to America, which is what happened in a certain case I'm thinking of, to go from that leap to say, in a new multinational era, it really doesn't matter where the money comes from. It's fine for me to take money from oligarchs overseas. And it's my guess that that door opening to political action campaigns, to the idea of an advocacy in big, dark organizations, is one of the things that threw open the door to the intrusion of Russians and probably other countries on our elections, but also that has really run the risk of determining the speech that is allowed in America and the speech that gains traction in America. I mean, I will end simply by saying it's no accident that I'm here on Facebook. I am doing it really deliberately to be here to fight back against the platform that has disseminated the most disinformation in 2016. And I obviously don't have to be here. My colleagues don't do their work over here. But I do it because I feel like this is a place that was starving for actual fact, rather than the kind of stuff that was getting thrown around by really big moneyed organizations that were trying to advance their own causes rather than the cause of American democracy. All right, well, that was not exactly where I intended to go or where I intended to end, but that's close enough to an hour. And after all, I put in 8 minutes early, messing things up. So I'm running a little bit behind, but I'm also a little bit extra tired at the end of this. I hope this was useful. And if so, I will do it again next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And on Thursday, midday, 1 o'clock, I'm doing the history of the Republican Party and chasing that through. So that if you're interested, you can stop in there. We also post these to YouTube without comments, so the stuff that's going on right now in the notes won't bother you. And I will say, for those of you who are bothered by what's happening there, unfortunately, I can't get rid of the comments on videos. I can get rid of, I actually don't do it. I have a moderator who gets rid of the comments, the trolls on the letters, but the videos don't let us do that. They stay live, so you can't ban those people or those bots. So I'm afraid those will have to stay, and I'm sorry about it. Anyway, so there we go for today, and I hope this was useful. And if so, I will see you next week. Again, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer. Thank you very much.